I knew moving into this neighborhood with a brand new pool would draw some attention. But I never expected it would lead to the kind of chaos that Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, was about to unleash on me. And before I dive into what happened, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what went down will leave you shaking your head in disbelief as much as it left me standing there, wondering how I got stuck with neighbors like this. So here's how it all started. After months of saving, planning, and finally finishing the construction of my new backyard oasis, complete with sparkling blue water, decorative stonework, and a modern security gate with a coded lock, I was proud of what I had built and eager to enjoy it with my family in peace. Yet Karen, who always had a nose in everyone else's business, immediately made it her mission to act like she had some say in how I used my own property, showing up uninvited just days after the contractors packed up and saying things like, "It's such a shame for a pool like this to just sit behind a fence when the whole neighborhood could enjoy it." And I knew from her tone that she wasn't just making small talk. She was planting the seed of entitlement in her mind that this pool somehow belonged to her, or at least to the HOA she constantly used as a weapon against the rest of us. At first I tried to laugh it off, telling her it was private property and meant for my family and invited guests only. But she didn't even blink at my response. She just smiled in that smug way of hers and muttered something about how sharing builds community, which immediately made me uneasy because I could already picture her trying to orchestrate some ridiculous HOA pool schedule as if this was a public facility. So I decided to stay vigilant and keep the gate code private, only giving it to close friends and family. But I underestimated just how far Karen was willing to go. It was the following Saturday when I woke up to the sound of loud chatter, music, and car doors slamming outside, and when I looked through my upstairs window, my jaw nearly hit the floor. At least 50 people were piling into my backyard, towels over their shoulders, coolers in hand, and kids already sprinting toward my pool as if this were a resort, and right at the center of it all, dressed in her oversized sun hat and holding a clipboard like she was some kind of event organizer, was Karen herself, barking orders about where people should put their things, who should watch the kids, and even setting up lawn chairs she must have dragged from her garage. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing, because not only had she invited these people without my knowledge or permission, she had also clearly framed this as some kind of neighborhood pool party with her as the hostess. My first instinct was to storm down there and throw every last one of them out. But I remembered the lock on the gate and realized something important. The crowd wasn't actually in the water yet. They were just gathering around while Karen kept promising she had the code and would let them in at any moment. And that's when it clicked that she must have assumed I was too careless to actually secure my property, or that maybe she could bluff her way into pressuring me into opening it. But either way, she had no idea I had locked it tight and wasn't about to budge. So I decided, instead of losing my temper, I'd watch and see how long it would take before her little plan fell apart. I slipped outside quietly, staying near the corner of my yard, hidden by the trees, just to observe as Karen put on her show. And it was almost comical watching her try to punch random numbers into the keypad like some second-rate safecracker, pretending she just needed a minute while all her guests, many of whom I didn't even recognize from the neighborhood, meaning she had actually invited outsiders to, started to grow restless, fanning themselves in the sun and glaring at her as she failed again and again. Kids were whining about wanting to swim. Adults were opening their coolers and cracking beers as if this were their backyard. And the more Karen failed, the more obvious it became to everyone that she had promised them access she didn't actually have. And I could see her face turning red as beads of sweat rolled down her forehead. Yet she kept insisting she was just waiting for me to honor the HOA tradition of community sharing. That was when I stepped out from my hiding spot, made my way over, and with the calmest voice I could muster, said, "Looking for something, Karen?" And the way her head snapped around, eyes wide like she'd been caught stealing, was priceless. Though she immediately tried to cover it up by faking a laugh and saying, "Oh, there you are. We were just about to start the neighborhood swim day. I assumed you wouldn't mind since this pool is such a wonderful addition for everyone," but I cut her off mid-sentence, my tone dropping, and told her firmly that not only was this trespassing, but also a violation of every possible boundary of respect. and that these 50 people she dragged into my yard needed to leave immediately because no one was swimming here, except my invited guests. And the murmurs from the crowd confirmed they were realizing they had been duped into thinking this was some sort of community event. Still, Karen being Karen, she doubled down, arguing that the HOA bylaws required all communal resources to be shared. Which was absolutely false because the pool was on my private property and had never been part of any agreement. And when I told her to show me in writing where it said she had any authority to invite people onto my land, she blustered and waved her clipboard like it was proof. But when I snatched it out of her hands, all it contained were some handwritten notes she had made about snack rotations and lifeguard shifts, which only made the crowd laugh at her delusions of grandeur. Seeing her facade crumble was satisfying, but I also knew Karen wasn't the type to back down gracefully. So when she finally realized she wasn't getting through my gate, she turned her embarrassment into anger, shouting that I was selfish and unneighborly, and accusing me of ruining the spirit of community. Yet as she ranted, people started packing up their things, some shooting me apologetic looks as they left, while others muttered under their breath about wasting their Saturday because of her lies. And within 20 minutes, what had been a chaotic mob turned into a slow trickle of cars leaving the street, until finally only Karen was left standing there, fuming, clutching her clipboard, and vowing this wasn't over, that she would escalate it to the board and make sure my selfishness didn't go unpunished. I didn't even bother responding. I just locked eyes with her for a moment and then turned away, because deep down I already knew she'd try something again. But I also knew one thing for sure. I wasn't about to let Karen or her entitled guests ever step foot in my pool. And whatever she tried next, I'd be ready for it. Because if she wanted to fight over my own property, then she had just declared war. The following week, after Karen's disastrous attempt to host her unauthorized pool party, I thought maybe she had finally embarrassed herself enough to retreat into her house and leave me alone. But that would have been far too easy, because Karen was the type of person who couldn't accept defeat. And instead of letting the matter die quietly, she escalated her antics in ways that were both infuriating and almost unbelievable. Starting with a letter she hand-delivered to my mailbox, with the HOA letterhead stamped across the top, though it was clear from the shaky formatting and the grammatical errors that she had written it herself, rather than getting it officially approved by the board. And in it, she claimed that my pool was to be considered a shared neighborhood amenity under the spirit of community fairness, that I was required to allow HOA members and their guests access at designated times, and that failure to comply would result in appropriate enforcement actions, which was laughable because I had already consulted the bylaws when I first built the pool, and nowhere did it mention anything remotely close to her claim. So I knew this was just another power play. But it still got under my skin because she was attempting to put me in the wrong in front of my neighbors. I decided to confront her directly, walking up to her porch with the letter in hand and knocking until she opened the door. Her smug smile plastered across her face like she had already won something. And when I waved the paper and told her this was fraudulent and carried no authority, she just shrugged and said, "Sometimes you have to create the rules that should exist, even if they haven't been written yet," which was one of the most twisted, entitled things I'd ever heard her say. And I told her flat out that if she or anyone else attempted to trespass on my property again, I'd call the police without hesitation. She tried to scoff, saying, "The police won't waste their time on neighbor disputes," but I shot back that trespassing was a crime. And if she really wanted to test that theory, she was welcome to keep pushing her luck. And then I walked away before the argument could escalate further. I hoped that drawing a firm line would stop her. But Karen wasn't just stubborn, she was obsessed. And within days, she began holding little HOA meetings on her lawn, dragging out folding chairs and inviting whoever she could lure into attending, loudly proclaiming to anyone within earshot that my pool was a symbol of selfishness and that the neighborhood deserved to enjoy it together. And although most people didn't take her seriously, I could see a few of the newer residents shifting uncomfortably, clearly not knowing who to believe, which annoyed me even more because Karen thrived on sowing doubt and conflict. One evening, as I was grilling dinner in the backyard, I overheard her voice drifting over the fence, rallying her little crowd with dramatic phrases like, We must stand united against exclusion. And this is not how good neighbors behave. And I realized she was trying to build momentum for some kind of vote or petition, even though she had no legal ground to stand on. Rather than get drawn into her theatrics, I decided to bide my time, keeping my pool gate locked and my security cameras rolling. But I admit it wore on me, the constant sense that she was plotting, waiting for another chance to make her move, and that chance came sooner than I expected. It was a hot Saturday afternoon, perfect pool weather, and I was just getting ready to swim with my kids when I heard the sound of multiple car doors slamming again. And when I looked out front, my stomach dropped because there was Karen leading a smaller but still noticeable group of people. About a dozen this time, marching toward my backyard like soldiers on a mission, each of them carrying towels and bags, and Karen herself holding what looked like a printout of some document in her hand, waving it in the air as if it were some kind of warrant. I met them at the gate before they could even get close, blocking the entrance. And Karen immediately shoved the paper in my face, declaring, "This is a petition signed by members of the community demanding access to your pool and by majority rule. You are now obligated to comply." I snatched the paper from her and scanned it quickly, seeing maybe 7 or 8 signatures scrawled across it, most of which I didn't even recognize, and I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. Asking her, since when did a petition override private property rights? But she just jabbed her finger at the page, insisting that the will of the people had to be respected. And when I told her bluntly that the only will that mattered on my land was mine, her face twisted with fury. The group behind her was clearly growing uncomfortable, some muttering that they thought this was all settled, but Karen barked at them to stay put, claiming I was bluffing and that if they stood their ground, I would eventually cave. But instead of arguing further, I pulled out my phone and started dialing, telling her loudly enough for everyone to hear that if she and her crew didn't leave immediately, I was calling the police right then and there. That was when the group began scattering, some walking back toward their cars, not willing to risk a confrontation, and Karen tried to stop them by yelling, "Don't let him intimidate you. We have rights." But it was no use, because within minutes, she was standing there alone, red-faced and trembling with rage, muttering something about how she was going to take this higher. I didn't even bother finishing the call. Just slid my phone back into my pocket and told her I had all the evidence I needed on camera, so the next time she tried anything, I wouldn't just threaten to call the police. I would press charges. She stormed off then, stomping across my lawn in a huff. And as I watched her retreat, I realized something important. Karen wasn't just going to give up. She was escalating every time she lost, and sooner or later she was going to try something even bigger. Something reckless, and I needed to be prepared. So that night, after locking the gate and double-checking my security cameras, I sat down at my computer and began researching legal options, making sure I knew exactly where I stood if this turned into a battle with the HOA itself. And the more I read, the more confident I became that Karen was bluffing on every front. But the thought that kept gnawing at me was, this Karen wasn't rational, and a person like that, backed into a corner, could easily resort to underhanded tricks. And the worst part was, deep down I knew she had only just begun. I should have known Karen wouldn't rest after being humiliated twice in front of her so-called supporters, because within days she had taken her scheming to an entirely new level. And it started subtly, almost like she was trying to wage psychological warfare against me. First, by sending out HOA community newsletters that were clearly written by her, even though she tried to make them look official, filled with passive-aggressive notes about members who refused to contribute shared resources and the importance of collective spirit, which everyone in the neighborhood knew were aimed squarely at me. And though some neighbors shrugged it off as typical Karen drama, I could feel the tension building because a few people started to look at me differently when I walked down the street, like they were wondering if maybe I really was being unreasonable by not letting everyone swim in my pool. And that was exactly what Karen wanted, to isolate me and paint herself as the defender of community values. At first I ignored it, figuring her gossip would run out of steam. But then things escalated again, one sweltering. Friday afternoon when I came home from work to find the lock on my pool gate tampered with, The metal scratched and bent as if someone had tried to force it open. And immediately I knew it had to be Karen, or one of her followers, because who else would have any reason to break into my yard? And the thought of someone sneaking around behind my house while I wasn't there sent a chill down my spine, because it wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about my family's safety. I checked the security footage, and sure enough, there she was, plain as day, walking confidently up to the gate with a pair of bolt cutters in her hand, looking around nervously before attempting to snap the lock. And though she gave up after a few minutes when it wouldn't break, the sight of her committing actual criminal damage enraged me like nothing else had. So I downloaded the footage, burned it onto a flash drive, and called the police to file a report. When the officer came by to take my statement, he shook his head and told me it wasn't the first complaint he'd heard about Karen, that she had a reputation, even outside of our neighborhood, for causing trouble, and that they'd pay her a visit to have a word. But I could tell from his tone that unless she actually succeeded in breaking in or caused more serious damage, they weren't going to press hard. Which frustrated me because I knew she'd interpret that as a slap on the wrist and keep going. Sure enough, 2 days later, she was back at it again. This time hosting a loud barbecue in her front yard and inviting half the neighborhood, blasting music, and loudly telling anyone who'd listen that I had weaponized law enforcement against her, turning myself into a villain in her ongoing fantasy battle, and I could see from across the street that she was pointing at my house repeatedly, whipping up her crowd with stories about how greedy I was for keeping such a luxury all to myself. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but I forced myself to stay calm, knowing that blowing up would only feed her narrative. So instead, I doubled down on tightening my defenses, installing a stronger lock on the gate, upgrading my security cameras to higher resolution, and even putting up a tall privacy screen along the fence line to block her view. Though I knew deep down that none of it would stop her, because she wasn't motivated by logic. She was motivated by ego, and nothing fueled her more than being told no. My suspicions proved right the following weekend when she made her boldest move yet. And it all started with me waking up to the sound of splashing water and shrieking laughter coming from my backyard. And when I bolted downstairs and threw open the curtains, my blood pressure skyrocketed because there inside my locked pool area were at least a dozen kids and teenagers, splashing, playing, and even eating snacks on the edge of the pool as if it were their own, with Karen herself sitting smugly in a lawn chair nearby, sipping lemonade and acting like she was supervising her grand event. I stormed outside, demanding to know how they'd gotten in, and she looked me dead in the eye with that infuriating smirk and said, "Oh, it's amazing what a little persistence and creativity can accomplish, isn't it?" Which made it clear she had somehow bypassed my new lock, probably with the help of someone who knew their way around tools, and I was so furious I could barely see straight, telling her she was trespassing and needed to leave immediately, or I was calling the police again. But she just laughed and waved her hand at the kids, saying, "Do you really want to be the monster who throws children out of a pool on such a hot day?" Think of the optics. That word optics burned into my brain, because it was proof she wasn't doing this out of some misguided sense of community. She was playing a calculated game of manipulation, trying to make me look like the bad guy no matter what. And the worst part was that some of the kids looked genuinely confused and frightened, like they didn't realize they weren't supposed to be there, meaning Karen had lied to them too, probably telling their parents she had permission. I pulled out my phone right in front of her and started dialing, and only then did she finally spring up from her chair, shouting, "Fine, fine, we're leaving." No need to overreact before calling the kids out of the pool one by one. And as they shuffled out, dripping water across my patio, she leaned in close to me and hissed, "You can't stop me forever. This is bigger than you. And I will win," before stomping away with the herd of children in tow. I filed another police report that night, this time handing over the video evidence of her and the kids trespassing. And the officer I spoke to promised they'd escalate it, but again, I could tell they weren't going to drag her off in handcuffs anytime soon, which left me feeling helpless, like I was stuck in some nightmare where my property rights meant nothing and my tormentor was untouchable. But as angry and frustrated as I was, a new thought began to form in the back of my mind. Something I hadn't considered before. If Karen wanted to play games and keep pushing, maybe it was time I stopped reacting defensively and started thinking offensively. Maybe it was time to turn the tables and make her the one caught off guard for once. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized she thrived on control. And nothing would break her faster than losing it in front of the very people she wanted to impress. And though I didn't know how just yet, I swore to myself that the next move wouldn't be hers, it would be mine. In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away, leaving Whiskers content and purring in the sun. After the chaos of finding Karen, her little army of kids splashing in my pool, I spent the next several days replaying everything in my head, going from sheer anger to cold calculation, because I knew if I kept letting her dictate the pace of this feud, I'd always be one step behind. And the thought of living in constant defense against her madness was exhausting. So I decided that if she wanted a war over my property, I'd give her one, but it would be on my terms. And that meant setting her up to fail spectacularly in front of the very people she was trying to win over. The opportunity presented itself sooner than I expected when the HOA announced an official neighborhood meeting scheduled at the clubhouse. The first real one in months, and I knew Karen would seize it as her grand stage to push her pool agenda. So I prepared by gathering every shred of evidence I had. The videos of her trying to break the lock, the footage of her leading kids into my pool, the ridiculous petition she shoved in my face, and even copies of her fake newsletters. Because if she was going to try to play the righteous community leader, I was going to strip that mask off in front of everyone. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was buzzing with more people than I'd seen attend in years. No doubt drawn by Karen's constant hype about neighborhood fairness, and when I walked in carrying a folder thick with evidence, I could feel her eyes burning into me from across the room, her smug grin already plastered across her face as if she had this in the bag. The meeting began with the usual formalities, the board members running through budgets and maintenance issues, but Karen wasted no time seizing the floor, raising her hand dramatically and then standing without waiting to be called on. Projecting her voice like she was giving a campaign speech, she launched into a long-winded rant about how our community is being divided by selfishness and how a pool of such scale should not be hoarded by one family when so many could benefit, and I could see a few heads nodding along, especially the newer residents who didn't know the full story. While others rolled their eyes, clearly fed up with her antics, but Karen thrived on attention, and she kept going, waving her hands, declaring that she had tried peaceful measures but been met with hostility, and that now it was time for the HOA to vote on making my pool a shared neighborhood amenity. My blood boiled as she said it, but I stayed calm, waiting for her to finish, because I knew what was coming next. When the board opened the floor for discussion, I stood slowly, all eyes turning toward me, and I began by stating firmly that my pool was built entirely on my private property. With my own money, and under all legal and HOA regulations, it belonged solely to me and my family. But then I went further, pulling out my folder and laying out piece by piece the evidence of Karen's relentless harassment. Starting with the newsletters, which drew chuckles from the crowd as I read aloud some of her more absurd lines about communal resources, and then showing the video of her caught on camera with bolt cutters at my gate, which caused an audible gasp to ripple through the room. Karen's face went pale, but before she could cut me off, I played the footage of her sitting smugly by my pool while kids trespassed in the water, and suddenly the murmurs turned into outright outrage. Parents in the room glaring at her for endangering children and lying to their families, while others shook their heads in disbelief that she had taken things this far. I could see her shrinking in her seat, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out the so-called petition she had waved in my face and held it up, explaining how it had no authority whatsoever. And then I finished by saying, "This isn't about community. This is about one person's entitlement and obsession with controlling what doesn't belong to her, and I won't stand for it any longer." The room erupted in chatter, and for the first time I saw Karen lose her composure, standing and screaming that I was twisting everything, that the footage was taken out of context, that she was only trying to bring us together, but her voice cracked with desperation, and the board president finally banged his gavel, telling her to sit down and reminding everyone that private property rights were untouchable under HOA rules. The president even turned to Karen directly, telling her she had crossed serious lines and that her behavior would be formally reviewed for violations of conduct. And the look on her face at that moment was pure panic. Her grand stage turned into her public downfall in front of all the people she had been trying to impress. I walked out of that meeting feeling like I had finally regained control, the murmurs of support from neighbors reassuring me that most of them were on my side now. But even as I basked in that small victory, a nagging thought tugged at me. Karen wasn't the type to take humiliation lying down. And though I had struck a major blow, I knew in my gut she wasn't done yet. Sure enough, the very next week she began retaliating in petty but infuriating ways, filing bogus complaints to the HOA about noise whenever my kids laughed too loudly in the yard, claiming my landscaping was unsightly, and even leaving passive-aggressive notes on my doorstep about trash, cans not being brought in fast enough. And though none of these stuck, it was her way of showing me she wasn't going away. She was just shifting tactics. I tried to ignore her, but then one evening, as I was sitting on the patio, enjoying some peace, I caught a glimpse of her peeking over the fence with binoculars, as if she were spying on whether or not we were using the pool. And that sent my anger boiling over again, because it wasn't just entitlement anymore. It was harassment, an obsession bordering on stalking. I considered calling the police right then. But another part of me realized this was exactly the kind of unstable behavior that would eventually implode on its own. And maybe, just maybe, I could use her paranoia to set a trap she wouldn't be able to wriggle out of. The idea came to me slowly at first, but then sharpened into a plan. If Karen wanted so badly to force her way into my pool, then I'd create a situation where she couldn't resist trying again. Only this time, I'd make sure the consequences were unavoidable and undeniable. Because the truth was, as much as I wanted peace, I was tired of waiting for her to make the next move, and I was finally ready to finish this war once and for all. I decided to stop playing defense and set a trap that would expose Karen for what she truly was. Not just to me, but to the entire neighborhood. And the plan had to be meticulous because she was cunning and loved a spectacle. So I began by quietly enlisting the help of a few neighbors who had watched the drama unfold and were tired of her theatrics, people who'd seen the video at the HOA meeting and were willing to be my eyes and ears. Without making a show of it then, I started crafting the bait. A faux Community Appreciation Day flyer that looked official enough to lure her attention but vague, enough that only someone nosy and determined would try to weaponize it. I printed the flyers on plain paper and slipped them under doors and on community boards, wording them with phrases that I knew would trigger Karen's instinct to intervene, lines like special neighborhood, pool day, volunteers needed to host and supervise, and seeking community involvement to ensure safe, shared access. I didn't put any identifying information on them. No names, no times. Just a hint that someone was trying to organize neighborhood access to the pool and that volunteers were needed. And because Karen had an insatiable appetite for being the hero of any imagined crisis, I knew she wouldn't be able to resist stepping in to save the day. While the flyers circulated, I looped in a few neighbors to act as unwitting witnesses, people I trusted, who agreed to be present at the edges of the property that afternoon, under the guise of taking their kids to the park, but in reality, ready to observe, and if needed, record. I also took extra precautions, new locks, a dummy keypad that looked accessible but was in fact only a decoy, and hidden cameras positioned to capture every inch of the gate and pool area from multiple angles. So there would be no question about what transpired. I wanted irrefutable proof in case she tried yet again to sabotage the lock or lie her way through the story. Then I did something else that felt dangerous but necessary. I uploaded a cryptic post to a private neighborhood chat, one that only residents could see, mentioning that the pool would be open to vetted volunteers under owner supervision and that anyone interested should message the poster privately. The goal was to bait Karen into responding publicly or privately and reveal her intent to coordinate access without permission. As the days ticked down, I felt a mix of adrenaline and guilt. This was entrapment in spirit, if not in land. I wrestled with whether I was stooping to her level. But every time I looked at the footage of her with bolt cutters or remembered the kids in my pool, I knew I had to act. The morning of the setup dawned bright and oppressively hot, the sort of day perfect for a pool, and I played my part carefully. I left the gate visibly locked, went about my morning chores, and staged a small folding table just outside the fence with lemonade and a sign that read "Volunteers Check-in" in plain handwriting to make the scene look authentic to anyone watching from the street. Karen, predictably, couldn't help herself. By late morning, she appeared across the road like a general arriving at the front lines, clipboard in hand and wearing that infuriatingly confident smile. She came alone at first, scouting, but within an hour she was rallying a few people, some of them neighbors who hadn't been at the HOA meeting and were still unsure, and a handful of curious onlookers from beyond our cul-de-sac charisma working on the unsuspecting. I watched all of it from behind the blinds, my stomach tight, my heart pounding because I knew a confrontation was imminent. But I also felt strangely calm because for once I felt like the director of the scene rather than a character being manipulated. As Karen moved closer to the gate, her voice carried across the yard, sweet and firm, saying, "We're only here to help. We're not causing trouble. We just want to make sure everyone can enjoy this amenity," and she gestured toward the dummy keypad in a theatrical way, pretending to fumble with it while whispering to a neighbor that she had connections who could open it. I could see some of the onlookers nodding, unsure, but the neighbors I'd recruited shifted their weight and fingered their phones, subtly positioning themselves to capture anything that happened. The bait worked perfectly. Karen called an impromptu volunteer meeting right there at the gate, laying out plans for supervising hours, rota shifts, and even a volunteer lifeguard schedule she insisted on assigning. And as she spoke, I could see the dangerous gleam in her eye, the one that always came just before she tried to take a step too far. Sensing the moment was right, she made her move, with a theatrical exhale and an overconfident grin. She reached for the keypad, pretending to input a code, then leaned closer and attempted to jimmy the lock, clearly trying to create the impression she had a right to be there, or at least the ability to override my security. But this time, my cameras captured every gesture in crystal clarity, and a few of the neighbors stepped forward to block the approach, asking politely but firmly if she had authority or written permission, and that's when the cracks began to show. Karen's practiced composure trembled. She stammered something about community interest, and we'll have to discuss it, but one of my recruited neighbors, Mr. Alvarez, who'd watched his own 3 kids nearly be dragged into the pool during Karen's previous stunt, leaned in and said in a voice as steady as a judge, "You don't have permission to be here. You've harassed the owner, you've damaged property. And we've all seen the evidence presented at the last HOA meeting." At that point, Karen's face flushed, and her mouth opened and closed as if she were searching for a script someone else had written for her. She tried to pivot, calling the small group overly dramatic and insisting she only had the best interests of the neighborhood at heart. But the tone had changed. People who'd once been on the fence were now watching with suspicion rather than admiration, and you could nearly feel the shift in air as support eroded. Not satisfied with merely creating doubt, Karen attempted to escalate by cornering one of the volunteers, an excited young woman who'd shown up thinking she was signing up to help, and whispered lies that the homeowner was hoarding amenities and that the volunteer should stand with her. But the woman looked embarrassed when Mr. Alvarez produced his phone and began to play the video footage of Karen's bolt cutters incident, and the small circle of onlookers began to murmur with disbelief, their eyes tracking between the screens and the woman who had been pulled into Karen's orbit. Panic flashed across Karen's features. She suddenly seemed tiny without an audience to command. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, she stomped toward the gate and grasped the metal frame with both hands, trying to force it open physically. But because I had reinforced the latch and hidden a second internal catch that could be released only from inside, her efforts merely made her look desperate and reckless in front of the very people she'd hoped to persuade. Someone called out that they were contacting the HOA president, and another neighbor, Mrs. Green, whose teenage son's safety had been threatened by the trespassing, pulled out her phone and started live streaming to a small community group, narrating the scene calmly so there could be a public record. This is Karen attempting to trespass and forcibly enter private property after being shown video proof of prior misconduct. The fact that the moment was being broadcast shifted the dynamic completely. Neighbors who had once allowed themselves to be swayed by her charm began edging away, some even muttering apologies, while others visibly shook their heads. Karen barked orders at people to stay and listen, but her voice had lost its edge. The performance was over, and what remained was a raw, exposed person trying to stitch the frayed pieces of a narrative together. She looked around, eyes flitting wildly, and finally, with a strangled shout about corruption and collusion, she shoved past her dwindling supporters and stormed off down the block, leaving a trail of bewildered people who were only then recognizing the full scope of what she'd been up to. As she retreated, I stepped outside for the first time that day, palms damp, and met the eyes of the neighbors who had stayed. Some offered quiet thanks. Others merely nodded in solidarity, but all of them had seen what I'd seen, and now had video proof to back it up. I collected the footage, backed it up in multiple places, and knew in my bones that things had changed. Karen had been humiliated in public, and the community's patience had been exhausted. But I also knew better than to assume this would be the end, because she had hitched her identity to being the arbiter of what the neighborhood should be. And people who tie their worth to control rarely let go willingly. Still, as the sun began to dip and the yard cooled from the day's heat, I felt a fatigue unlike any other I'd known, a mix of relief and the heavy realization that the next moves would determine whether this conflict would finally die or escalate into something uglier. And with that thought at the back of my mind, I began preparing for whatever came next, aware that the momentum had shifted, but that the final act, the one that would truly seal the fate of Karen and my peace, was still to come. Karen's retreat that day felt like a victory. But I knew it was only the calm before the storm, because she was not the type to lick her wounds quietly. In true to form, within days, whispers began circulating in the neighborhood that I had entrapped her, that I had plotted against a fellow HOA member, that I had set up an innocent woman just to make her look bad. And though anyone with eyes or a shred of common sense could see the absurdity of those claims, rumors had a way of slithering into ears and planting doubt, especially when Karen nurtured them with phone calls, porch chats, and her endless manipulation of the HOA channels. One evening, I overheard a neighbor mutter as I walked by. Maybe he went too far, and it made my blood run cold, because that was exactly how Karen operated. She lost ground publicly, but then clawed it back in private by casting herself as the misunderstood victim. I knew I had to stay ahead of her, and that meant transparency. So I reached out to the HOA board directly, sharing with them all the footage, the statements from neighbors who had been present, and even a written timeline of events to ensure there was no wiggle room for her version of the truth to gain traction. The board responded cautiously. They admitted the evidence was damning, but they also expressed concern about community harmony and avoiding escalation, phrases that sounded suspiciously like they were preparing to let her off the hook once again in order to avoid conflict. That response hardened my resolve. If the board wouldn't act decisively, then the neighborhood itself had to be given the truth in full color, unfiltered and undeniable. So I began preparing a compilation video. With the help of a tech-savvy neighbor, I stitched together clips of Karen cutting the lock, leading unauthorized guests to the pool, attempting to force the gate, and being confronted by multiple witnesses. We layered timestamps and short captions for context so there could be no accusations of editing trickery. And once it was complete, we circulated it not only in the private HOA group, but also in a broader community forum where families discussed local issues like park maintenance and neighborhood safety. The impact was immediate, and visceral. People who had never even used the pool were suddenly furious. Not just at Karen, but at the idea that one person felt entitled to endanger children, damage property, and harass a homeowner just to feed her ego. Comments poured in, some incredulous, some mocking, others downright angry. And for the first time, Karen's name was associated not with her version of leadership, but with recklessness and arrogance. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but Karen, cornered and desperate, Escalated in a way I should have predicted but didn't fully see coming, she went to the county office. She filed a formal complaint accusing me of operating a commercial pool without a license, claiming that my pool was being advertised as a public facility and that I was profiting from neighborhood use. The audacity left me speechless when I received the notice in the mail because it was a lie so outrageous it almost defied logic. It had had enough official weight behind it to force an inspection. On the day the inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, I led him around the property, heart hammering in my chest, and explained the entire ordeal while showing him the footage and the signed statements from neighbors. He raised an eyebrow and said, "This is one of the more bizarre complaints I've seen, but protocol required him to finish the inspection, so he tested the water, measured the gate height, checked for signage, and asked a litany of questions that all pointed toward the obvious. This was a private residential pool, not a commercial operation." By the time he left, his expression had softened into something like sympathy, and he promised to file a report clarifying the matter and noting the malicious nature of the complaint. Relief washed over me, but only partially, because it was clear Karen's war wasn't about truth, it was about pressure. About grinding me down until I either yielded or exploded, and I had no intention of doing either. If anything, her new tactic made me realize she had lost the neighborhood's backing and was now flailing for outside intervention, which meant the real battle wasn't just about my pool anymore, it was about setting a precedent for the entire community. Could one person weaponize lies, bureaucracy, and intimidation to rewrite reality? Or could evidence, persistence, and collective will shut that down for good? Fueled by that realization, I organized a neighborhood forum of my own, independent from the HOA, inviting everyone to my backyard not to use the pool, but to sit in folding chairs and hear the full story directly from me, and from the neighbors who had been dragged into Karen's chaos. Nearly 40 people showed up, a turnout larger than most HOA meetings. And under the fading evening light, we shared everything, the videos, the threats, the complaint to the county on. I watched faces shift from curiosity to shock to indignation. When I finished, there was a long silence, then a round of applause, then a swell of voices demanding accountability. Neighbors who had once remained neutral now volunteered to speak out, to write letters to the board, to formally censure Karen. It was a watershed moment, the kind of groundswell that couldn't be undone by her whispered lies. And though I knew she wouldn't give up quietly, I also knew she had lost something more valuable than a gate code. She had lost control of the narrative. That night, as I locked the pool and walked through the darkened yard, I felt a rare sense of peace, though it was tinged with the awareness that Karen was a cornered animal now. And cornered animals didn't retreat, they lashed out. What form her retaliation would take, I couldn't predict, but I braced myself, because the final confrontation felt inevitable, and I had to be ready when it came. I didn't have to wait long for Karen's retaliation because within the week, the HOA scheduled an emergency meeting, clearly pushed by her behind the scenes, and the agenda item listed in bold was private pool usage and compliance, which was laughable considering the evidence already presented. But it showed me how determined she was to claw back power, so I prepared carefully, bringing printed copies of the inspector's report, witness statements, and a USB loaded with every video angle I had archived. The meeting that night was packed, the room overflowing with folding chairs and murmurs as neighbors filed in, their faces etched with curiosity and anger, some whispering my name, others muttering about Karen. She sat at the front with her usual smug posture, lips curled in the faintest smile, as if she believed the tide had turned back in her favor. And she wasted no time when the meeting opened, launching into a tirade about reckless homeowners and unsafe practices and how community amenities must be equally shared, her words sharp, her gestures theatrical. But this time, instead of nods and polite silence, she was met with skeptical stares, crossed arms, and a few audible scoffs. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, placed the stack of documents on the table with deliberate calm, and began not with accusations but with facts, reading aloud the inspector's findings, showing the time-stamped video of Karen cutting the lock, then playing the footage of her failed rally at the pool gate, the crowd murmuring louder with each clip. The HOA president tried to maintain order, but the room was alive with whispers, people gasping, muttering, even laughing at the absurdity of Karen's behavior. By the time I finished, the evidence sat like a mountain between us, undeniable and crushing. And when Karen leapt to her feet, shrieking about doctored videos and collusion, even her allies pulled back. Unwilling to tie themselves to a sinking ship, the president finally intervened, his voice weary but firm, declaring that the HOA had no authority over private property, that my pool was legally compliant, and that further harassment would be subject to legal review. It was the closest thing to an official exoneration I could hope for, and the room erupted into chatter, many neighbors coming to my side to shake my hand, some apologizing for ever doubting me, others promising to push for Karen's removal from her HOA committee positions. Karen, red-faced and trembling, stormed out before the meeting adjourned, her heels clicking like gunshots in the hallway. And for the first time in months, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. Not because I believed she was gone for good, but because I knew the community had finally seen her without the mask. In the days that followed, her presence in the neighborhood diminished. The constant emails and flyers stopped, her little porch gatherings thinned, and her once commanding presence at HOA events faded into silence. Though I still caught glimpses of her pacing her yard, glaring across the street, eyes filled with a venom she no longer dared to unleash publicly. My pool became mine against quiet afternoons swimming laps, evenings hosting small barbecues with friends and family, mornings sipping coffee on the deck without the gnawing dread of intrusion. But the lesson stuck with me. People like Karen thrived not on truth, but on fear, manipulation, and silence, and the only way to break their hold was through persistence, documentation, and unity. One neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, joked one evening as we shared a beer by the fence that I should teach a class on how to handle a Karen, and though we laughed, part of me knew he was right. Standing up to her had cost me time, energy, and peace. But it had also rallied a community that had long been intimidated by her antics. As summer drew to a close, the pool shimmered under the fading light, not as a battleground, but as a symbol of boundaries defended. And I realized the ordeal had changed. MIA was no longer the quiet neighbor who let things slide. I had become someone willing to fight for my rights, no matter how ridiculous the opposition. Yet I never allowed myself to fully relax, because deep down, I knew Karen's silence was not surrender. It was the silence of someone plotting, waiting for another opportunity, another stage to reclaim her lost spotlight. And when that day came, I promised myself I would be ready with evidence, allies, and the same unshakable determination that had carried me through. And if you've ever faced a Karen in your life, someone who refuses to respect boundaries, who twists truth into lies and turns neighbors into pawns, you know how vital it is to stand firm, to shine light into the shadows they thrive in, and to never let them convince you that right and wrong are just matters of opinion. This battle may have ended, but the war against manipulation and entitlement is one every community faces sooner or later. And the only way to win is to stand together. If you want to hear more stories like this, raw tales of HOA drama, neighborhood chaos, and everyday people fighting back against impossible odds, then don't miss out. Subscribe to Sham Stories now, because the next story might just be even crazier than this one, and you won't want to miss how it unfolds.